Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a couple of exciting IEMs, or actually I should say a few exciting IEMs, one of which I've already covered in the 7Hz Timeless, but what I've got today is two direct competitors for the Timeless that both use fairly unique driver types. Specifically what I'm talking about is the Raptgo Hook, which combines a planar magnetic with the piezoelectric driver, and I'll explain what all these mean in a moment, and the other is the Thieaudio Elixir. The Thieaudio Elixir uses what they're calling a 3D velocity transducer diaphragm, and whilst it's not entirely clear what that is, it does do a few things differently as far as I can tell, and I'll talk about those shortly. The reason I'm bringing the 7Hz Timeless into this mix is that it's in the same price category, and for a long time now, according to me and many others, it's been one of the best options on the market, and it uses a planar magnetic driver, which is still not super common in IEMs, but becoming more common. And so come with me now as we find out if these new players on the market are just gimmicks or if they've actually got something to offer to take them over and above the already fantastic 7Hz Timeless. The Raptgo Hook here is a $239 IEM, and as I said in the intro, it's got both a combination of a planar magnetic but also a piezoelectric driver. Now what the piezoelectric driver is all about is it's a different kind of driver mechanism where it's a small ceramic component that actually vibrates when the electrical current passes through it. Because it vibrates rather than having any sort of pistoning motion, it's actually a very linear presentation of the audio as far as I understand it, but it is also limited to high frequency sounds. And so it's taking care of the treble, while the planar magnetic driver takes care of the bass and the mids. Something else that sets the Hook apart is that it's also an open design. And so the back of these, whilst there is quite a closed grille on them, isn't entirely closed. You can hear a little bit of the outside world, I'll talk about that soon, but it makes them a pretty unique IEM, and I was excited to see what that brought to the listening experience. The final thing I'll mention here in terms of specs and design is that they're a 15 ohm IEM, making them fairly easy to drive, potentially prone to hiss from some devices. But in my testing across a range of devices, I didn't have any issues. It's just worth noting that if you do have a hiss-prone device, these might bring it out both for their impedance, but also their sonic character, which I'll talk about in a moment. Before I get there, let's talk about the comfort, the accessories, bits and pieces like that. Comfort-wise, these are good. They're a design that we've seen over and over again. It's kind of this semi-custom universal molded style. They've got the standard size nozzle that most IEMs on the market use. They come with a lovely cable. It's a beautiful green fabric wrapped cable that's got the changeable connectors at the amplifier end, so you can have a 3.5, 2.5 or 4.4mm connection just by pulling off what's on there and putting a fresh one on. In addition to a nice cable, you get this grey carry case, which is nothing special, it's just the standard kind of semi-hard case. And then you also get a lovely range of tips. So the comfort, the design, the accessories, everything that you get with the Raptgo hooks is just great. Because of that open design that I mentioned before, in use there is a little bit of leakage, but it's pretty minimal and it's mostly the high treble. So you don't tend to hear the full range of music leaking out of these like you would with an open back headphone. With these it seems you're really only hearing what that piezoelectric driver is doing, and it's all treble content. So unless you've got someone sitting or lying right next to you, it's probably not going to be an issue that these leak a little bit. Going in the other direction, if you're worried about isolation from the world around you, I'd say the Raptgo Hook isolate like a semi-open headphone, or a slightly open, not one of those massively open headphones. So we're not talking about, say, an HD800 level of lack of isolation. We're talking more along the lines of what you get from, say, a DT900 Pro X, some of the harmonic dyne headphones like the Poseidon and the Zeus, those headphones that are technically open, but not the most open sounding headphones. And to give you a specific example, using my mechanical keyboard, I can hear the keystrokes when I'm wearing the hooks. And specifically, I mean I can hear the little clicking sounds from the keyboard. which from a normal pair of IEMs, I might hear a general sense of kind of rhythmic thump from the keystrokes, but not the actual texture of the keystrokes or the detail of the clicking sound of the keyboard, which I can from the Raptgo Hook. I didn't find them open enough to be distracting at all, but they're not a particularly isolating IEM. And so let's talk now about the sound quality of the Raptgo Hook before I talk about the other IEMs and how they all compare. The sound from the Raptgo Hook has this wonderful sense of expansiveness to it. I just happened to start my listening test with an orchestral track, and the Raptgo Hooks gave a wonderful sense of scale and clarity to the orchestra. They cover the full range of frequencies really well, so everything in the orchestra from the bass notes all the way through to the upper textures of the orchestra, everything was beautifully rendered. The treble from the hooks using that piezoelectric driver is well extended and well detailed, and things like triangles in the orchestra sounded wonderful. What I did find though was that on some tracks, as I moved through a range of different music, on some tracks, the treble from the Raptgo Hook can be a bit overdone. It doesn't get harsh, it's actually wonderfully smooth all the time, but from a tonality point of view, I just think they've pushed it a bit too far in some cases, and it makes the tonality of the music just a little bit unnatural. At the other end of the scale, the bass from these is well controlled, well extended, it's not enhanced in any way, but it's good and present. Thinking about the general presentation, the soundstage has good width, it's got a little bit of depth, and the separation of sounds is also strong. And so overall they're an enjoyable earphone that I find to be particularly good for orchestral and classical type music, but one that does have a slightly unnatural tonality due to the extra treble energy, even though it's delivered well. And so I'm going to park things there for now, and let's go talk about the Thieaudio Elixir before we compare the two together. Before I talk about the Elixirs, I just want to apologise if there's background noise. I'm going to do my best to remove it if I can, but the gardeners have arrived next door, and it sounds like a massive swarm of bees or something has arrived because they're using a whippersnipper or a weed whacker, depending on where you are in the world, and it's really loud, so I apologise if there's background noise. Hopefully it won't be too distracting for the rest of the review. And so for now, let's get on with talking about the Thieaudio Elixirs as a potential competitor to the Timeless and also the Raptgo Hook. The Elixirs come in just a little bit cheaper than the Raptgo Hook because these come in at $209 US, so $30 cheaper, not a huge difference. As I've already said, these use what's being called a 3D velocity transducer. Now, transducer is just a fancy word for the driver in a pair of earphones or headphones. That could be a balanced armature, a planar magnetic. All of these are transducers. The piezoelectric in the Raptgo Hook, that's a transducer as well. And there's no diagrams anywhere that I could see of exactly what this looks like. So it could be fancy terminology for just a regular dynamic driver, or it could actually be something brand new. I'm not entirely sure. Everything I did read about these says that it does still have a voice coil, so that leads me to think that maybe it is just a fancy type of dynamic driver. But what does make it a bit unique is it's using multiple layers of carbon nanotubes, which are a very rigid form of carbon, and those are apparently overlaid with beryllium, which is a very light and very rigid metal. And so even if this is just a dynamic driver being over-marketed, there's some good technologies going in there. Carbon nanotubes are lightweight and rigid, beryllium is lightweight and rigid, and that should translate into a very responsive and clean-sounding driver. Before I tell you if it's paid off though, let's quickly cover off the accessories. The cable on the Elixir is nice. It's a copper coloured sort of cable. It's nothing special. It doesn't feel quite as lovely as the Raptgo Hook cable, and it doesn't have the changeable plugs at the amplifier end, which I really love about the Hook. But it's a nice enough cable, no complaints at all. You also get a decent case. I've seen these before from lots of brands, they're not uncommon, but it's a nice enough design. And then finally, we also get a nice set of tips again. So in terms of design, accessories, comfort, I'd say the Raptgo Hook is slightly ahead of the Elixir purely because I like the cable feel better. I'm not saying it's a better quality cable, I just like the look and feel of it. I think the tip selection is probably on par between the two. And of course the Hook does have that changeable plug, which I love. But in terms of the actual design of the shells and the comfort of the shells, I think they're pretty much on par. And so where things are really going to get separated is how they sound. And so let me start by talking about the Elixir on its own, and then we'll get to the comparisons. My initial impressions of the Elixir are that they've got a very balanced tonality. Nothing stood out to me in their sound, and I mean that in a good way. They've got an ever so slightly forward, upper mid-range or lower treble, and what it serves to do is just bring the vocals slightly into emphasis, or the instrumentals if it's a guitar or something like that. It just emphasises them a little bit, but it's been done really tastefully so it doesn't tilt the tonal balance unnaturally and it keeps them sounding fantastic. One of the particular standouts from the Elixirs is they make details really available, really tangible and really tactile, but not unnatural once again. It certainly makes me think that the claims about the driver being super responsive due to the carbon nanotubes, the beryllium, etc., it makes me think there's truth in that. They certainly sound like a very fast, responsive driver, and what I mean by that is a driver that's able to start and stop quickly as the musical signal requires, and that therefore doesn't blur the edges of any transients, any particular details in the music. In some ways it actually reminds me of having the speed and the detail of an electrostatic combined with the presence and the weight of a dynamic driver. And that's not to say that it's as good as an electrostatic driver or as good as the best dynamics that I've heard, but my point is it's got some characteristics of both. And that's where I think that there is definitely some sort of positive technologies, and what I mean by that is not just marketing hype. I think there is actually some really good technology being applied to the Elixir. I also should say that I don't know for sure that if what I just described is actually what's happening. I don't know exactly what it is about the driver that's causing the sound to be how it is. It's just the way I perceive it. I perceive it to have some of those characteristics of electrostatics and dynamics, but I don't know for sure if that's what's causing what I'm hearing. I just know that it sounds great. And so far I'd say that for the price, it's absolutely fantastic. The other thing I should mention is that I found in terms of frequency response that both the bass extension and present are good, as well as the treble extension and the sense of quality and refinement in the treble as well. And so after listening to both in isolation, that being the Hook and the Elixir, I thought I preferred the Elixir slightly, but as is often the case, the only real way to find out which I absolutely prefer was to put them side by side on exactly the same track and go back and forth between the two. Starting off just comparing the Elixir and the Hook, so I was leaving out the 7Hz timeless for now, I'll get to that in a moment. So starting off with the Elixir and the Hook, I cycled through a couple of tracks and I'm going to talk about two of them. The first one is Love Stain by Jose Gonzalez, and with the Elixir, the quality and the clarity of the guitar was nothing short of wonderful. That sense of tactile, articulate delivery was a real standout from the Elixir with this particular track. Jose Gonzalez's vocals were focused and natural, and they came across with a nice balance of richness, but also texture and clarity as well. And so the Elixir was off to a flying start. Moving over to Don't Be a Fool by Gregory Porter, quite a different sounding track overall, and here the bass was full and solid. The vocal is once again rich and textured, keeping in mind that Gregory Porter's vocal is a much deeper voice, but there was a nice combination of richness and fullness from his baritone, along with that texture and airiness that you need to hear for a really lifelike vocal. The instruments in this track were well separated and the vocal was clearly focused, and overall the Elixir continued to impress. Switching over then to the Hook with the same two tracks, and starting off talking about Don't Be a Fool, the extra treble emphasis from the Hook brings a bit more texture to Gregory Porter's vocals. And I also found the saxophone benefited from that a little bit too, but it went a bit too far when it came to things like the cymbals. So while I enjoyed the sense of extra texture and kind of air in the vocal and the saxophone performance, when I took in the entire sonic picture, the snares and the cymbals from the drum kit just started to sound a little tiny bit off. They weren't bad by any stretch, but not as natural as I feel like the Elixir delivered. Thinking about the bass qualities for a moment, the Hook gives a little bit less sense of presence and fullness in the bass, not by a huge margin, but you might be getting just a bit more texture through the bass in return. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. I'm not going to say one's better or worse than the other. I think they both deliver bass really well. But then as I changed back over to Love Stain, I once again was reminded of where I think the Hook has just brought itself undone a little bit. And this is not to say it's a bad IEM, but in comparison to the two, the extra emphasis on treble from the Hook just goes too far, and whilst it brings out a wonderful sense of articulation and clarity from the guitar in the Jose Gonzalez track, it also makes it sound a bit unnatural. It overemphasizes it to a point that whilst it's interesting, it doesn't sound like a real guitar in the room with you. And indeed, I think the simplicity of Love Stain as a track really showed me the separation between these two IEMs. The Elixir sounds articulate and detailed, but natural. The Hook sounds a bit overdone, like it's trying a bit too hard. And so for me, the Elixir is immediately the more impressive of these two IEMs because it is both detailed and natural. It's articulate, it's clean, it's got all of the frequency range balanced really nicely, but it doesn't try too hard in any particular area, and that allows the music to be the winner rather than an individual frequency or sense of detail that the Hook wants you to focus on. Another area that kind of shocked me that the Elixir pulled ahead, given the extra treble from the hook, is that I actually feel like the Elixir separates sounds better in the soundstage. So whilst the hook might produce a slightly larger overall soundstage, the sense of space between the instruments for me goes to the Elixir. And so the ability to hear individual sounds if you want to, while still enjoying a coherent overall picture, that again goes to the Elixir for me. So I'm going to re-emphasize the point that I made before. The hook is not a bad IEM. I just think it goes a little bit too far with the treble. It makes things a tiny bit unnatural at times. Whereas I think the Elixir balances it perfectly. As I said, it's detailed, it's textural, it's articulate, but it's natural first and foremost, and it lets the music be the hero. And so with that in mind, I was then curious to see, is the Elixir better than the 7Hz Timeless? And that's a big call because I love the Timeless. Firing up Blue on Black by the Kenny Wayne Shepherd Band, as I jumped back and forth between the Elixir and the Timeless, I was reminded of how cavernous the Timeless soundstage is. It doesn't extend outside the head, but somehow it creates this wonderful sense of massive space within the head, and probably depth in particular. With the Timeless, everything is wonderfully balanced on this track, that being Blue on Black. The vocals are well focused, the bass is solid and punchy but well controlled, and all the instruments are well separated, they're well rendered, but they all also sound natural. And so whilst this recording isn't the greatest recording ever, it was a very enjoyable listen from the 7Hz Timeless. When I then switched over to the Elixir, still listening to Blue on Black, the Elixir's extra information or energy in the upper mid-range and the lower treble immediately made the Timeless kind of sound like it had been a bit dark and a bit closed in. I don't mean from a space point of view, I just mean that it was like with the Elixir, everything just opened up from a frequency response point of view, and I felt like I could hear more of what was going on. And in fact, I'd say the Elixir had the smaller overall sense of soundstage, it didn't have that cavernous sense of space that I feel like the Timeless delivers. But I do think the Elixir was still providing as good or maybe slightly better separation of sounds. And so even though the soundstage isn't as big, the ability to separate sounds and hear each individual instrument or note is excellent from the Elixir, and it prevents it from ever sounding congested or closed in. As you might have already guessed from the fact that the Elixir's got this wonderful sense of articulation, the fact that it makes the Timeless sound a little bit darker overall in sound, what that also means is the Elixir comes across with a better sense of clarity, articulation, and detail when compared to the Timeless. What I also found was that it more tightly focused Noah Hunt's vocals in this track, and it made the location of the vocals in the soundstage a little bit more tangible, a little bit clearer and more focused. Another thing that I noticed was that as this track gets a bit busier, and remembering that it's not the best recording, the Elixir managed to keep everything a bit more separated. Whereas I think with the Timeless, things started to kind of blur together a bit more. The Elixir keeps it more separated, but again, in a coherent way. Having said that, before you think it's all going in the direction of the Elixir, it is possible, depending on the track and the source, the Elixir is going to be the one that's likely to get more fatiguing sooner. That extra emphasis in the upper mids and lower treble can sometimes be too much. And I've actually got a video talking about this soon as to why you might perceive an IEM differently to me, and that can often play into exactly the range that I'm talking about. And so for some people, the Timeless is going to suit them better because it's a more easy listen, a more relaxing listen, because it's a warmer, richer sound overall. So I don't for a second sit here and say that the Elixir is the clear-cut winner. In my opinion, it is potentially the more impressive and more technically capable IEM, but both are still wonderful. I do think the Hook is a nice IEM, but for the price that you're paying for it, I don't see why you would choose the Hook over either the Elixir or the Timeless. So basically what I'd say is that if you're after a really spacious, rich, warm, engaging sound, that's where the Timeless is wonderful to me. If you wanted something that had a bit more emphasis on clarity, articulation, and detail, then I'd go straight to the Elixir, and that's where I do feel like the Hook kind of sits in a clear third place. The Timeless and the Elixir could easily live side by side in the same collection because they're different enough, but they're on the same level of performance. Whereas I think the slightly unnatural sound that I find the Hook to create just pushes it a bit aside for me. And so I'm going to wrap this up by giving another recommendation for the Timeless, but also adding a strong recommendation for the Elixir. And so as always, I hope this video has helped you to clarify which one might be right for you, your sources, your preferences. Speaking of preferences, I should mention, if you are almost predominantly a classical listener, you might actually find the Hook to be the best of the bunch here, although the Elixir is still very strong in that regard. And so hopefully I've helped to clarify the right options for you, your preferences, and your sources. If you have found the review useful and helpful, I'd love it if you hit the like button, consider subscribing, and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.